let's give it a try. Welcome to a new feature, series, segment called Vocabulary Word of the Day. For this first time through, the vocab word is vernacular. So this is one of those words that everybody sort of knows what it means, but I've got a little bit of a deep dive for you into what it has meant, where it came from, and the ways in which we use it and how that's changed. The word comes from the Etruscans, and the Etruscans used it in a very specific sense. To them, a verna, or a vernaculi, was a slave born in the house locally rather than born abroad. So, not a original generation slave, but perhaps a child of an original generation slave, born into slavery. So this is sort of interesting because of some things that Malcolm X said. One of his major arguments was that in America, we are all, in a sense, vernacular. As he said, slavery was never abolished in this country. It was only extended to all the races. So when the Latins imported this concept and this set of letters, this word, the original meaning from the Etruscan about a slave born into the local house rather than born abroad, that didn't seem to have a great deal of utility. And so the word gradually came to mean simply domestic, native, indigenous. In the current situation, we use native and indigenous a lot. We don't use vernacular in this sense, though. It's not particularly a useful word to describe what we mean when we say native or indigenous. Even in the noun sense, we say the vernacular, but we're not talking about a person, enslaved or otherwise. We're talking about language, which we'll get to in a second. So the Romans, speaking Latin, took this concept of vernaculus and applied it to a lot of different things. Anything that was domestic, native, or indigenous. And the way it got into English, in the sense that we use vernacular today, is through the Latin phrase vernacula vocabula, the native vocabulary, let's say. So as a noun, vernacular refers to, in English, native speech or language of a place. And that's been true for, roughly speaking, 300 years. That's how it gets used in English. So the vernacular speech of a place is in itself a quite interesting concept. Applying this word that once talked about slaves to language changes what vernacular is. And when we talk about a place and the language used in that place, of course, there's people move. So the language moves, the vernacular changes. What does it mean to be vernacular or the vernacular with regard to a particular place? Well, it can mean a lot of different things, but a little definition that I swiped from the wiki people. It says, of language, vernacular, native to a place as opposed to literary. And that really interests me. Opposed to the literary. So the vernacular is not high speech. It is not culture-wide speech. It's like the difference between a piece of classical music and a folk song. The folk song being vernacular music. So even though I'm a lover of words and an inveterate user of words, I too have always been opposed to the simply literary. I call what I do belletrism, from belles lettres in the French, meaning beautiful letters. And to me, the belletristic is superior to the literary. Where does the vernacular fit into that? It's a kind of belletrism that is native to a place. There's a couple of other things that it's come to mean. As we said, vernacular music, a vernacular poem. Might think of Yeats there maybe, although he was certainly highly literary. It also means the language or vocabulary peculiar not just to a place, but to a class or a profession. So presumably, plumbers would have their own vernacular. Programmers would have their own vernacular. And so the word gets repurposed to describe those things. Not just the language of a place, but the language of a profession, perhaps, or even a class. That might be the most interesting thing of all. The language indigenous to a class. Just as with talking about Malcolm and slavery, I'm not going to go into a big soliloquy about the class war, but I think it is true that the vernacular can be said to be the language that's native to the working class, to the common folk. Down in the comments section below, I want you to describe to me other ways that you may have heard vernacular used or understood. And I want to encourage you to teach me. Beyond what I've said, what does vernacular mean? Maybe you could just comment long enough to use vernacular in a sentence. We'll see how this goes. Vocabulary. Word for the day, vernacular. See you around.